Outlander is a historical drama series with a spin of fantasy that has accumulated a fan base mostly owed to the show's headstrong female protagonist Claire and her romance with Jamie Fraser. As loved as the show is, it has managed to get away with certain flaws because of the commitment of its fan base. Here are all the plot holes and mistakes we found. First, we have inconsistent appearances. In the pilot episode, Claire is seen hurriedly tending to the wounds of an injured soldier. Her hands and even her face appear to have splatters of blood on them, but somehow during this whole ordeal, her white apron remains spotless. In a later scene, showing Claire standing outside after the soldier has been sedated, you see the previously stark white apron is now shown bloodied. A faux pas like this is hard to look past, especially when you see something similar in future episodes. In Season 4, Episode 12, Brianna's clothes seem to be defying the very laws of object permanence as her cape vanishes and reappears from one frame change to another. And Lord John Grey and Brianna are shown walking around Wilmington during Brianna's first return to the town. She is shown without her cape, but shortly after, as she approaches the prison where the criminal who had raped and impregnated her was held, a black and blue cape magically appears around her shoulders. We assumed she might have fetched the cape from Lord John Grey's carriage, but at no point did she enter the carriage. In fact, the carriage had been shown to have departed way before, making this mistake painfully obvious. Next, the Forgotten Druids. In the first episode of Outlander, the Druids are introduced as something akin to witches, but not exactly. They were known to perform rituals at the Stone Circle as observed by Claire and Frank at Crag na Dun. The Druids were shown to be dancing at the break of dawn, but nothing more was said about the significance of their presence in the show. However, they were brought up once again soon after Claire had been transported to the past and was rescued by Murtaugh from Jack Randall's unscrupulous advances. The Druids were shown to have some sort of association with the workings of the entire saga of time travel, but the fact that they were never brought up again as the show progressed raised a lot of questions. There might still be time to tie up this loose end, but for now, it is another question unanswered. Now we have the historical inaccuracies. Granted that this show is a work of fantasy fiction, it is still based on historical events, and a number of people in the show actually existed, so blunders in historical accuracy are quite unexpected. The witch trials, for one, were probably one of the most imprecise events that could have occurred. It was highly unlikely for it to happen at the time, since the outrageous practice of accusing women of witchcraft and burning them at the stake had been brought to an end around 1727, which is nearly 2 decades before the show's timeline. Another eyebrow raiser was brought to attention in Season 3 when Claire and Jamie had arrived in Georgia to make a new life for themselves in America. This is absurd, since America didn't even exist at the time. The American Revolution hadn't even happened yet. If anything, Claire's proposition to settle in America should have caused Jamie to raise a question or two. Next, how does the time-traveling thing work? Doesn't anyone find it odd how the whole time-traveling phenomenon is yet to be properly explained? For a show that bases its entire storyline off of the concept of its protagonist being transported across timelines, it sure does seem to give its audience a very vague grasp of how the whole thing actually works. The fact that there's no proper explanation or a set of rules which tell us what causes these events to happen all the time seems pretty questionable, especially when everyone's still pretty clueless about the physics of it all. That isn't all. Roger Mackenzie's encounters with several of his ancestors on different occasions also remain unexplained, along with the function of the gemstones, which were suggested to be required for time travel. Which brings us back to the first episode, where Claire was sent back in time at Crag na Dun. What gemstone was she carrying? Her wedding ring from Frank was a simple band of gold, so how did she manage to get transported all the way back to the year 1743? There's also the question of how the characters are transported to the locations they appear at. When Roger and Bree were sent back to 18th century America, along with their son, they had both been thinking of home. So did the stones bring them back there based on their thoughts and knew exactly where home was? Fans are still hoping these mysteries are resolved by the time the show's final season is released. Up next, Frank's encounter with the apparition. Earlier in the story, before Claire had even met Jamie, Frank claimed to have seen a ghostly Highlander outside their home in the first episode, Sassenach. His description of the strange figure is eerily similar to that of Claire's 18th century husband, right down to the brooch he wears on his plaid. Despite his accurate description, Claire doesn't seem to recall her first husband's story when Jamie confides in her about a vision of the future. Moreover, Frank doesn't seem to connect the dots when Claire returns to the present day in Season 2 and eventually confesses her experiences with Jamie in 18th century Scotland. Is it possible that Frank remembers seeing the ghost and it helps him believe Claire's story of time travel? Does he ever realize that the ghost he saw was Jamie? Given his historian nature, we're sure he could tie the stag brooch to the Fraser clan to confirm. But the persistent question still stands as to why this whole ordeal was never brought up by neither Claire nor Frank throughout the show. Jamie may or may not have visited Claire in the future, but the mystery of his apparent appearance has hung over the series like a dark cloud since the first first season. Now, we have Jamie Fraser's unexplained wealth. Although Jamie has been shown throughout the series to have a good standing and reputation in Scotland, in earlier episodes the audience was never given the impression that the Frasers were well off, let alone wealthy. In fact, in season 1, Jamie had to use his hard-earned savings to afford a ring, which he gives to Claire on their wedding night, and later to buy her a medicine box as a present. Can you blame us if we find it increasingly odd when money is suddenly no problem when Claire and Jamie go on their travels? On top of that, Jamie seems to have convenient connections in high places wherever they go. In France, they are invited to a ball at the court of the Palace of Versailles, where the pair arrives dressed in extravagant, bespoke clothes. Claire in her sweeping red gown and Jamie in an equally dazzling ensemble. Later in Jamaica, the two are once again invited to attend a lavish party where Aunt Jocasta's character is introduced, along with her sprawling wealth in her estate. Jamie could have inherited from Aunt Jocasta, but it still doesn't explain how he and Claire were able to afford all their extravagance before her appearance, nor how all these opportunities seem to conveniently land in Jamie's lap. Lastly, Galis' death. Galis has traveled through time several times, most notably to the 1700s, to continue living her life after finding out about the time travel stones. But anyone who's watched the show would point out that despite Galis being in the 20th century for some time, her bones had already been discovered long before. That further makes you wonder, if Galis in the 1700s died and her bones exist in the cave already, how come Brianna meets her in Scotland a few months after they find her bones? While Galis was still around and speaking to Brianna in the present day, her bones seem to still be there, despite not going back in time yet. Some speculations suggest Galis lived in both the present and past. Her present 20th century life ended when she went through the stones, and then her timeline continued in the 18th century, where she eventually died. All these assumptions aside, there's no concrete hypothesis for Galis' death and her resurrection. Another fan concludes that it's a paradox of time travel, and is possible because Galis' movement through time is linear despite our perception of the circular timeline. With so much time travel occurring in the show, it's no wonder the storyline can be split up into multiple timelines. That's a wrap for this video. Did you notice any of these plot holes while watching the show? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.